Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're cracking open a massive medical and forensic cold case to uncover the biological truth behind history's deadliest pandemic. For centuries, the events of the mid-14th century were just shrouded in myth, superstition, and terror. But today, well, using modern science, ancient DNA, and historical epidemiology, we can finally build a complete profile of the unseen assassin that literally brought the medieval world to its knees.
Okay, let's jump right in by confronting the sheer scale of our microscopic suspect. When the death ships rolled into Europe in the late 1340s, they unleashed a wave of devastation that is honestly hard to even wrap your head around today. We are looking at a staggering death toll of up to 50 million people. That's roughly 50% of 14th century Europe's entire population, just wiped out in a matter of a few short years. Entire towns were left completely empty, eventually just reclaimed by the surrounding forests.
To really grasp the horror of this, you have to look at the visceral, first-hand accounts. Take the Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio, for example. He described the terrifying physical realities of the disease, writing about tumors in the groin or armpits, some growing as large as a common apple, which he called an infallible token of approaching death. Just imagine the reality these victims faced. There was absolutely no modern science to explain what was happening to them, no concept of germs or bacteria. They were completely defenseless against a killer they couldn't even see.
So, here's our roadmap for this investigation. First, we'll meet our microscopic killer. Then, we'll track down patient 0. After that, we'll unravel the transmission mystery. And finally, we'll examine the 3 distinct forms of the plague.
Let's start with part 1, meet the microscopic killer, where we identify the actual culprit behind this massive death toll.
You know, the crazy thing is, for centuries, humanity had absolutely no clue what was killing them. Doctors blamed everything from bad air, which they called miasma, to the alignment of the planets. It wasn't until way later, during an outbreak in Hong Kong in 1894, that a French-Swiss bacteriologist named Alexander Yersin finally identified our specific bacterial suspect, Yersinia pestis. He proved that this highly contagious organism was present in rodents and was the biological engine driving the entire nightmare. Which brings us to part 2, finding patient 0. Let's trace the genetic roots backward in time.
See, genetic analysis proves this pathogen wasn't just some sudden mutation in the 1300s. No, it was an ancient killer. Yersinia pestis evolved approximately 7,000 years ago during the Neolithic era. Then, around 3,800 years ago, it mutated to survive inside fleas, which was a massive evolutionary leap. But it's this final date on the timeline, 1338 to 1339 CE, where our specific outbreak, the Black Death, truly begins.
For the longest time, the origin was just vaguely attributed to the Far East, but recent science has brought a shocking level of precision to our cold case. In 2022, researchers looked at cemeteries in modern-day Kyrgyzstan with Syriac tombstones that indicated a spike in deaths from pestilence around 1338. By extracting ancient DNA from the teeth of 7 individuals buried there, scientists definitively proved that the bacteria in those graves was the direct genetic ancestor of the strain that would go on to devastate Europe. We literally found the plague's ground zero in the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia. Moving on to part 3, the transmission mystery. Let's dissect exactly how this isolated Central Asian strain managed to travel the globe.
Down at the microscopic level, the mechanics of how this spreads are just horrifying. The flea drinks infected blood, right? Then, the Yersinia pestis bacteria multiply and create this thick biofilm that physically blocks the flea's midgut. The flea is now literally starving to death. Driven into an absolute frenzy, it bites its hosts aggressively, but because its gut is blocked, it can't swallow. So instead, it regurgitates thousands of plague bacteria directly into the fresh bite wound. It's a vicious, brutally efficient cycle.
But here's where we introduce a major plot twist in modern epidemiology. For decades, the classic story was that infected rats died off in mass rat falls, forcing their starving rat fleas to jump to humans. But modern mathematical models suggest something totally different. When scientists ran the simulations, a human-to-human parasite model, meaning human fleas and body lice spreading it directly from person to person, actually matched the death patterns in 7 out of 9 European cities. The rapid, wildfire spread we saw in Europe might have been driven primarily by pests living right on humans themselves.
So the crucial point is that the bacteria had the biological mechanics dialed in, but it still needed human help to cross continents. And man, did we deliver. In 1346, during the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, the Mongol army suffered a plague outbreak and actually catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, an early, devastating use of biological warfare. Fleeing Genoese ships then unknowingly carried the disease straight to Sicily in 1347. Add to this the possibility that other diseases like anthrax were circulating and compromising immune systems, and you've got the absolute perfect storm for a transcontinental pandemic.
Finally, Part 4, 3 Forms of Plague. We're going to examine the escalating stakes and the 3 deadly variants of this disease. The first, and definitely the most famous variant, is bubonic plague. This happens when the bacteria from a flea bite travels to the nearest lymph nodes, usually in your groin or armpit. It hijacks the body's immune system, multiplying rapidly into those terrifying apple-sized lumps, or buboes, that Boccaccio described earlier. Victims suffered from intense fever, chills, and vomiting. Left untreated, bubonic plague had an 80% mortality rate, usually killing the host within about 8 days. But the stakes escalate dramatically with the second form, pneumonic plague. Here, the infection hits the lungs. And this is a total game changer, because now the bacteria bypasses fleas entirely. When a victim coughs up blood or even just sneezes, they expel aerosolized bacteria into the air. It becomes highly contagious straight from person to person, and it is incredibly lethal, carrying a staggering 90 to 95% mortality rate. And then we reach the absolute fastest and deadliest form of all, septicemic plague. In this variation, the bacteria just multiplies directly in the bloodstream. This triggers a massive inflammatory response, toxic shock, and actually causes the skin and flesh to die, forming dark purple or black patches, which, by the way, is partially where the Black Death moniker comes from. It is so rapid and so aggressive that victims often died before the trademark buboes even had time to form. The mortality rate here? Almost exactly 100%.
When you compare these 3 biological attack methods side by side, it makes total sense why medieval medicine, which relied on things like bloodletting or bursting the buboes, was completely useless. I mean, whether it was the 80% lethality of the bubonic form, the 95% of the airborne pneumonic form, or the absolute certainty of the septicemic form, once you had it, the odds were overwhelmingly stacked against you.
So how does this ancient nightmare connect to us today? Well, because 99.8% of the European population lacked any genetic immunity back in the 14th century, the survivors of this pandemic passed on some incredibly specific resilient traits. Because of this extreme genetic bottleneck, scientists estimate that today, roughly 15% of Caucasian Americans carry a genetic mutation that offers some resistance to the plague. Think about that. The Black Death literally altered the trajectory of human DNA.
Which leaves us with one final, really unsettling question. Yersinia pestis wasn't eradicated. It still circulates in rodent populations globally, and outbreaks still happen today, like the major ones we've seen recently in Madagascar. And sure, while we now have antibiotics to fight it, we've also begun to see drug-resistant strains emerge. So, as we close this case file, we have to ask, considering the modern resilience of this ancient microscopic killer, could a new version of the Black Death happen again? Thank you for joining me on this explainer. Until next time, keep questioning and keep learning.